Welcome to the class of the operation management, and I would like to discuss today. We're going to discuss on topic 10.1, which is aggregate planning. So, with the topic on the aggregate planning, what we're going to do is we're going to use one of the global company profile, which is Frito Lay. Okay, Frito Lay, and the things that we're going to discuss in this topic, which is what we call as the aggregate planning, the planning processes, the sales and operation planning, the nature of aggregate planning, the aggregate planning strategies, the methods of aggregate planning in services, as well as the revenue management. Now, let's look into the following slide. It tells us about Frito-Lay, the aggregate in planning in Frito-Lay, of which that there are more than 3 dozens of brands. 21 brands sell more than 100 million annually, and 7 sells more than 1 billion. Now, what happened is that the planning processes covered 3 to 18 months. And what is the uniqueness of this is that the unique process and the specially designed equipment. So this is what we are going to discuss in the aggregate planning, and on top of that we have what we call the high fixed cost required, which with the high volume and high utilization. Okay, so now let's look into the frigate cost planning in detail at Frito-Lay. So when we say that aggregate planning and Frito-Lay, we can see that the demand profile is always based on the historical sales, the forecast, the innovations, the promotions, as well as the local demand data. And on top of that, we have to match total demand to capacity, and we also need to understand the expansion plans and costs. And on top of that, the quarterly aggregate plan goes from 36 plants in 17 regions. So each of these plants can be developed into a 4 weeks plan, for which it is with regard to the product line as well as the production run. And then from then on we can look on the planning process. So if we look over here, we have what we call the top executive, the operation managers, and with sales and operations planning team. These are the middle managers and the operation managers as well as supervisors. This is the lower manager. So if you look over here, we have what we call the top executive. So the responsibility of the top executive is on the long range plans, and these long range plans will run over for more than 1 year or within 1 year. So in terms of the capacity decision, it supplements 7 of it, and the capacity decisions are critical to a long range plan. So what are the issues that arise normally from this, the planning process? The issue is that about the research and development, which is the R&D, and then we are talking about the new product plans. And not just about that, we need to look also in terms of the capital investment as well as the facility, location, and capacity. Now, that is the responsibility of the top executives. What about the middle executive, the intermediate range plan, which is from 3 to 18 months normally? Over here, the operation managers is responsible on the aggregate planning techniques, and actually over here it helps the managers to work the intermediate range plan. And normally the issues over here will be the sales and operation planning, the production planning and budgeting, the setting of employment, the setting of inventory as well, the subcontracting level, the analyzing of operating plans. So, with that, we need to look also in terms of the supervisors in the lower management. These people are normally going for the short range plan, and it's normally up to 3 months or within 3 months. The scheduling technique, which is in chapter 15, helps the managers prepare the short range plan. And what we can say over here is that there are issues also, for example, in terms of job assignment, ordering, job scheduling, dispatching, overtime, as well as the part-time help. Finished with the planning process, we move forward into the sales and operation planning. So what are the sales and operation planning? Sales and operation planning, we are talking about the coordinations of the demand forecast with functional areas and the supply chain. And this is normally with the typically done by cross-functional teams. And normally it is done by determining which plans are feasible. Limitation of the sales and operating planning also must be reflected, and moreover providing the warning when resources do not match expectation. Thus the output is an aggregate plan. This is the SOP and the aggregate plan. So as you can see, what we have studied previously in chapter 5 and chapter 7 and soon to be in chapter 14, we can see that we have made the product decision in chapter 5 throughout the research and technology. And from then on, we can see that the process planning and the capacity decision is made in chapter 7. And on top of that, remember we have discussed earlier on the supply chain support in chapter 11. And the previous one, whereby we are going to discuss also the inventory at hand in chapter 12. And it goes down to the sales and operation planning in developing the aggregate plan for the operation. And finally, what it be is that we can have the master production schedules and the MRP system, which is in chapter 14 later on. And finally, we're going to have what we call the detailed work schedule in chapter 15. Moving on, the sales and operation planning. Decision must be tied to strategic planning and integrated with all areas of the firm overall planning horizons. SOP is also aimed at the coordination and integrations of the internal and the external resources necessary for a successful aggregate plan. And on top of that, we have the communication of the plan to those charges with each executions. And what we need to have in the sales and operation planning is that we need to have a logical unit for measuring sales and output, a forecast of demand for a reasonable intermediate planning period in the aggregate term, and then a method to determine the relevant costs, and then a model that combines forecast and costs so scheduling decision can be made for planning period. On the following slide, we have what we call aggregate planning. So what is the objective of the aggregate planning? The objective of the aggregate planning is usually to meet forecast demand while minimizing cost over the planning period. That is the objective of the aggregate planning, and this is usually made with the forecast demand while minimizing cost over the planning period. Remember, when we discuss about operation management, we are talking about reducing the cost, which is to minimize the cost, and we are also talking about achieving the objective, which is the forecasted demand. Moving on from the aggregate planning, this is an example of it, of which in quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, we have the numbers of sales of product of 150,000 and so on, and this is what we call a aggregate planning. And lastly, aggregate planning combines the appropriate resources into the general terms. Part of this a larger production planning system, and it is a disaggregation, breaks the plan down into the greater detail. This aggregation results in a master production schedule. With that, I finish. I will end up the session, and thank you for attending, and we will meet in the next session. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.